So we're now into the very final module of this subject in political philosophy, political theory. And the module is called Module 5, Political Philosophy for a Future, Living Well and Dying Well in a Context of Ecosystem Collapse. Now it's week 11. We have 12 weeks in this subject. And this week, I'm going to approach the material through the lens of the problems that I faced in planning for and delivering this subject. And I'm going to offer you the opportunity to assist me to improve this module the next time I teach it, assuming that I do get another chance to teach this in the future, which I hope will happen. I'll also explain why I decided in the end to focus on the Global South and ecological refugees. And again, I'll leave you with an opportunity to help me think through this for the next time that I teach. So the plan is a little different this week. I'll first begin with problems that I faced with this last module. And I'll provide you with a further option for your last assignment, which reflects those difficulties that I faced with this module. Then we'll turn briefly to my own inadequate account of the historical context and the problems that emerged around this issue in the 1960s, 1970s. Conflict around our relationship, how to conceptualize our relationship to the environment. And we'll look at climate crisis and the Global South, political theory in this context. So let's remember the aims for the subject as a whole. Well, one aim was to locate the renewal of political theory and its potential contributions to today's problems in the context of responses to the US social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. So it was a very specific thing that we did. We didn't try and map out a broad history of political theory as a whole. We really tried to show how the renewal of political theory was a response to US social movements. This period really does seem to me to be significant in forcing political theorists to resume their work, rejecting the pessimism of their UK counterparts who, as we know, pronounced ethical and moral philosophy to be dead in 1956. And I think that's been a very interesting way to study political theory in this subject, and I've been happy with it so far. I hope you found it interesting to look at how political theorists, liberal political theorists, responded to the civil rights movement with theories of civil disobedience, to the war in Vietnam and anti-war protests with theories of just and unjust war and conscientious objection. How liberal political theorists conceptualize the family in the context of the women's and sexual liberation movements. How liberal feminists criticized liberal political theorists. And how these theories also became increasingly subject to criticism both by conservatives, by neoliberals aligning with new social conservatism, and by radical and queer theorists contesting the ways in which liberal feminists had conceptualized the goals of the objectives worth striving for. So we also showed how liberal moral and political theorists responded to debates between pro-life and pro-choice views, which really set the terrain for debates about reproductive technologies, contraception and abortion in the 1960s and 1970s, an outgrowth again of the claims by women's and sexual liberation movements for greater freedoms in reproduction and also greater control over births in a context of poverty. So we've seen how these theories really did grow out organically from this incredibly interesting period, the 1960s and 1970s in the US, with these important social movements, and how this really led to a renewal of political philosophy against the pessimism of UK philosophers who were not willing to engage in an endeavour that they felt led to judgments that could not be empirically verified. So that's what we've done. One aim was to locate the renewal of political theory in this context of responses to the US social movements in the 1960s and 70s. And another aim was to show how this renewal of political theory in the 1960s and 1970s primarily took initially a liberal approach, which emphasised only certain aspects of the US social movements at the expense of others. We've done that in each of the modules. You'll recall, for example, in the civil disobedience module, we saw how radical and deliberative criticisms of Rawls's liberal theory really focused on Rawls's exclusion of socioeconomic injustice as a ground for civil disobedience, because Rawls felt civil disobedience should really be grounded only in claims for basic rights and liberties. And we also saw that those same critics, radical and deliberative, also contested the methods, the circumscription of methods by Rawls's liberal theory. So we saw that liberal political theorists were not always attuned to were only attuned to certain aspects of the US social movements and not to others. And we've tracked this in each of the modules that we looked at this semester. A further aim was to show why, ever since, political theorists have articulated their views as a criticism or an extension of liberal approaches. It really hasn't been possible to enter a debate about these divisive moral and political issues without reference to how the early liberal political philosophers had responded and had proposed that we think through these issues. And so ever since, political theory has been about tackling either problems that the early liberal political philosophers had ignored, like that issue about the circumscription of objectives and methods in civil disobedience, as an example. Or they've also focused on new problems that have since emerged that appear as outgrowths to those earlier issues. And again, we did this in each module. So that's been the key aims of this subject. And a final aim was to encourage you to view yourself as contributing to this task of reasoning about the divisive problems that we face in our societies today, using ideals like public reason and being attuned to how those ideals also emphasise inevitably only certain aspects and not others, and how our thinking will inevitably involve a prioritisation of some ways of conceptualising the problem and the response over other ways. We saw this was even happening in Judith Jarvis Thomson's articulation of a defence of abortion in response to the pro-choice, pro-life debate, where she really didn't deal, we saw in placing this in historical context, where she really didn't deal with those other claims about a need to think about birth control and access to reproductive technologies as poverty alleviating mechanisms in view of an ideal of reproductive justice, which we saw the reproductive justice theorists, including Erica Miller, deal with. So we've seen in each case too that, political theory and engaging in this sort of reasoning will need to be an ongoing endeavour in order to try to respond to problems that had been ignored or problems that appear as outgrowths of those earlier issues. And you yourself, I hope, should now feel encouraged to contribute to this activity as well in your lives as political philosophers. That's been an important thing for me. I've wanted you to see yourself as a political philosopher as well. And not some elite activity, but something that we do as in our daily lives when we talk to people in certain ways about the problems that are divisive in our society. In this last module, I wanted to do something similar to what we've done in the previous modules. I wanted to go back to the 1960s and 1970s and map out for you the sorts of issues that were important to activists in the early stages of the environmental movement, because the 1960s and 1970s also saw the emergence of early forms of environmentalism. However, I haven't been able to do that very well. And this is a new subject, so it's possibly quite natural that there will be weaknesses in this subject. So what I want to do now is provide you with another option for your last assignment. I'll go through both options shortly, but I also want to give you the opportunity to help me think through how this module would be better taught for next time. So what were the problems that I've faced? Well, as mentioned, I wanted to look at the early environmental movement, which also surfaced in the US during the 1960s and 1970s. So it seemed like a really good opportunity to think about how liberal political theorists responded to the problems that the environmental activists were considering, just as we've done with the other topics like the civil rights movement, the anti-war movements, the women's and sexual liberation movements, reproductive technologies and access to abortion and contraception. I wanted to do something similar by looking at how political philosophers might be able to help us, well, might have tried to help think through the problems that the environmental activists were featuring in the 1960s and 1970s. So this early environmental movement seemed to have been informed by increasing awareness of the devastating impact that human economic activity was having on the world's ecosystems. We saw, for example, the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, which looked at the devastating impact of pesticides on insect and animal life, and the reliance of our ecosystems on the very insect and animal life that we were devastating. We also saw, for example, reactions to the first photos of Earth taken by astronaut Bill Anders on Apollo 8 in 1968 as part of the US's efforts to land the first person on the moon before Russia, before the Soviet Union, Anders captured the famous photo Earthwise, which viscerally depicted the vulnerability of our life and our entire dependency on this blue planet. You'll probably have seen this photo before, and also experienced that sense of both the beauty and the vulnerability of our planet, hovering there as if it could be eviscerated very quickly and easily, and also the realization that this is our only planet. There is no planet B, as we've seen on the posters. in the climate strikes. So I knew these were important events for the early environmental movement, and I knew that the environmental movement was important at this time too. But, and here's the problem, here's the thing, I couldn't actually find, in preparing this subject this year for the first time, any liberal political philosophers who dealt with this at all during the 1960s and 1970s, or even early 1980s. So we've seen that John Rawls is dealing with theorising civil disobedience in ways that provide a liberal interpretation of Martin Luther King's religious case for civil disobedience. We saw Michael Walzer articulating arguments about how we should understand just and unjust war in order to justify protest against US involvement in Vietnam. We saw the liberal political philosophers developing interesting theories of conscientious objection. We saw both liberal political theories of the family in response to the women's and sexual liberation movements, and a contestation of those liberal theories by liberal feminists wanting greater justice to overcome gendered inequalities. And we saw how this then gave rise in all of the treatment of these different subjects to critical accounts of how liberal political philosophers had responded to these issues. Again, we saw this happening with the consideration of the reproductive rights debates through the pro-choice, pro-life lens, with Judith Jarvis Thompson providing a moral ground or moral defence of abortion, and John Rawls helping us to think through how to justify political rights in a context of irresolvable moral conflict over such issues. But when it comes to the environment, I couldn't find anything suitable. There seemed to be no liberal political philosophers who dealt with this at all in this period. So it seemed like I couldn't follow the sort of approach that I'd taken with the other modules. It seemed like there really was an important social movement emerging from this period, but not really any liberal political philosophy about it. And that was the bind. I wanted to deal with it. I could see that was an important social movement of this era too, and yet there was this deficit of liberal thought about it that really wasn't the case for the other sorts of topics that we considered. So I want your help with this, and you have a chance now to do an assignment on this. If you don't want to, if you think that it is too hard, I am finding it very hard myself, maybe there doesn't exist any liberal political philosophy on it. Maybe it's not just that I haven't found it, but that it doesn't really exist. We'll have to see. I'd be happy for you to find that out in your work though. So I'm giving you a chance to do an assignment on this. But equally so, if you don't like this idea, you can go back to the creative reflection. That should be fun to do, which is really, I'd identified as your third and final assessment for this unit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to outline for you an assignment that you could do to help me out here with the teaching of this final module. And then I'm going to present to you the creative reflection that the subject outline currently lists as your assessment, your last assessment task for this unit. And you can choose between either of those tasks. So if for your last assignment you would like to do something other than the creative reflection that's currently listed in your subject outline, which I'll talk to you about in a moment, here is another option. Please prepare an account of how you would have taught this final module. Something along the lines of political philosophy, and environmentalism in the 1960s and 1970s, or political philosophy emerging out of the environmental activism of the 1960s and 1970s. What you would need to do is the following, as we've done every week, right? You would need to map out the historical context and problem. So this is 1,000 words, right, for this task. You would need to identify 2 key texts on the historical context of the environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s. That would help me map out next year, if I get to teach it again, this problem from the perspective of those involved. So these are the sorts of texts that I've relied on in each week in reconstructing the historical context for you, with deference to the views of the activists, deference to the views of those involved at the time, not to the political philosophers, but to the context, to the activists, to how they conceptualize their problems and so forth. That would be worth 5 marks out of 30. Then you would need to clearly identify what you see as the historically grounded salient aspects of the divisive problem as conceptualized by activists in the environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s, drawing on those texts. So I'd like this to deal with questions that I have not been able to answer for myself yet. Who were the key actors and activists? How did these actors conceptualize the problem? Why did they feel the need for activism? Who were they protesting against? Were concerns about the environment conceptualized as related to the claims for social justice embedded in the civil rights, women's and sexual liberation and anti-war movements? Or were environmental concerns conceptualized as quite different concerns? Were they articulated without reference to social justice as understood within the social movements? Was there agreement among activists about how the problem should be constituted, how the problem of environmentalism, of environmental damage, of harm, should be constituted? Or was there a great deal of variety? Was it mainly about pesticides, as in Rachel Carson's view? Or was it more broadly about Earth's vulnerability, as in the photo depicted from Apollo 8? Did the concerns of activists build in any way on a response to the environmental catastrophe of the Dust Bowl crisis of the 1930s and 40s, which was itself a major environmental disaster? This had a major impact upon the psyche of the out-migrating families, the farming families, for 2 generations at least. Did this have an impact upon how environmental activists responded to environmental harm, or conceptualised or thematised the problem of environmental harm? Or were the 60s and 70s quite unrelated to the problems that had emerged in the 1930s and 40s? What sort of conflicts existed among people about whether and how to thematise and struggle against these problems? So you can see why I can't do this work for you in this subject. I've done that work for you in the other modules, but I can't do that here. And that, I hope it's interesting for you to see, even if I can't do it for you, how an academic thinks about how to teach and how to go about achieving the objectives that I've set for myself and for you in this subject. I can't achieve those here. Why can't I achieve it? Is it because this is a particularly different type of movement, social movement in the 1960s and 1970s? Is it because liberal political philosophers didn't really deal with it? Is it? I don't know yet. So that's why I want you to help me think through this a bit. Then, so that would be worth 5 points too. So then in the political philosophy section, so in each module, we've looked at the historical context and problem, and then we've looked at the political philosophy, right? We've started with liberal approaches, liberal responses, and then we've looked at why some of those liberal responses have been deeply problematic and only featured certain aspects of the problem and not others. And I want you to do that for me here if you choose this task. Identify one or two primary texts by liberal political philosophers that would help the class to understand how liberal political philosophers, emerging out of this 1960s and 1970s social movement of environmentalism, made sense of our responsibilities in relation to the environment and explain their key ideas briefly. That would be 10 marks. Full references are needed. So the questions I have: did any liberal political philosophers actually tackle this issue? Rawls didn't. The major liberal thinkers didn't. What am I missing here? Now, if you cannot find primary texts by liberal political philosophers and you think you have found texts from that era, broadly speaking, 1960s, 1970s, early 1980s, reflecting back like Michael Walzer did. He wrote a bit later, end of the 1970s, reflecting back. If you find texts like that you think are still texts of political philosophy, thinking about how we should be behaving, providing reasons as to why and so forth, but they're not liberal, I would also be happy to accept one or two primary texts by political philosophers working in this period who were not liberal, because this would be interesting in and of itself. And we then need to consider, well, why didn't liberal political philosophers deal with this issue? The second part of considering political philosophy is to identify one or two more recent primary texts, contemporary texts by political philosophers that feature problems with how liberal political philosophers conceptualise the environment. That could be in the work of the text that you identify for me, or if they don't exist, a criticism of the oversights of liberal political philosophers in not even dealing with these issues at all. And I'd like to know what the key ideas are of those texts. Now, that's worth 30% in total, with the majority of your marks, 20 of those marks, linked to the political philosophy side of the response. You can see this is a harder task, hopefully a rewarding one, and it would be helpful for me. So I'd be very interested if you were to do this work to help me think through those issues for the future. But if you don't like that idea, or if you think that it might be too hard, given that maybe there is no liberal political philosophy out there responding to the problems that the environmental activists were concerned with in the 1960s and 1970s, if you think that it's all too complex at the moment, it's hard to get your head around, and you can see I share that view, then you can still just do the creative reflection, which should be a lot of fun. It's the last assignment and it's due on the 28th. So this task is called Political Philosophy Now and for a Future. And you must choose a web-based resource that helps you to describe a social and political problem that you think is imperative to respond to now or in the near future. I want you to draw explicitly on the liberal modes of reasoning employed by several political philosophers in this subject. I want you to anticipate what a liberal method of thinking would likely allow you to say about the social and political problem you're considering. And then I'd like you to consider how critics of a liberal approach might respond. And finally, I'd like you to make your own case of what should be done and why, because you here are also a political philosopher providing reasons that you think you think other people should be expected to accept. So the problem and the reasons for its urgency. This is part one of the creative reflection. Select a web-based resource that illustrates the present or impending urgency of this problem. The resource does not necessarily need to be scholarly. It can be a blog, an article in a newspaper, a podcast, a Twitter thread, a short story, a song, a film, or even a painting. Provide the full reference for your resource. If the resource is not scholarly, and likely this will be the case with the resource you choose, you will still need to reference it, following the style guidelines for that type of resource, because there are style guidelines for all sorts of resources. So this is your opportunity to practice referencing for non-scholarly resources, and that's also very important to do. But I also want you to explain how the nature of the resource makes you treat it in a particular way. So first I want you to explain how the web-based resource helps you illustrate the problem and its urgency. I also then want you to explain what the position of the web-based resource is, if it outlines a position. I also want, as I mentioned, for you to consider in 1 or 2 sentences, very briefly, how the nature of the resource affects how you make use of the resource. So is it mere opinion? Is it argument? Is it public interest reporting? Is it a creative work? For example, this is a Twitter thread that expresses a controversial position on this problem. And I've chosen it not because the Twitter thread should be interpreted as a fact, but rather because it's illustrative of division. I've chosen it to reflect the polarized and divisive nature of this problem. I'm not treating it as fact, but as illustrative of division. And that then shows to me that you're understanding how the nature of the resource should also have an impact upon how you treat it. In part 2 of the creative reflection, I want you to think with and beyond liberal political philosophy about your problem, how institutions should be organised to respond to the problem. So a liberal approach. Draw explicitly on at least one liberal political philosopher studied in this subject. We've often turned to Rawls, but you could also deal with Waldron if you feel that that problem is more relevant to the one you're considering, or you could deal with Judith Jarvis Thomson or Susan Waller-Auken, who each try to present a liberal approach to that topic. Explain what you think their methodological approach would allow them to say about your particular social and political problem. So, for example, Rawls thinks that we need to conceptualize ourselves as bearers of those faculties that allow us to experience justice as a problem, because we have differing comprehensive conceptions of the good life that lead us to come into conflict with each other on over the resources that we would need to be able to pursue that. And he also thinks that we should conceptualize ourselves as having the faculties that allow us to respond to that problem, not just the faculties that lead us to have that problem, but also the faculties that lead us to be able to resolve it. So we conceptualize ourselves as instrumentally rational in having a moral comprehensive doctrine and wanting to pursue it using means and reasoning. But we also have a sense of justice, and we want to be able to give others terms and conditions for our interaction that we think would be reasonable for them to accept if they have very different moral comprehensive doctrines too. So what does this sort of liberal approach allow you to say about your problem, your particular problem? Yeah? And then I want you to think about what are the problems with this liberal approach. Draw explicitly on at least one critic of liberal approaches. We've looked at quite a few. We've looked at the radical and deliberative criticisms of liberal conceptions of civil disobedience, for example, looking at Robin Selikartis. We've looked at radical and queer criticisms of Susan Moller-Ocken's liberal feminist accounts of the family, for example. We've looked at a variety of different critics of liberal approaches and explained how their concerns about liberal theory arose. So now you need to do something similar in the consideration of your topic. What are some potential objections to the liberal approach to your social and political problem? And then I want to know what you think should be done. Make your own case for what should be done and why. What sort of method of reasoning are you employing? And why is it appropriate for your social and political problem? What do you think should be done and why? So all in all, that leads to 30 points divided across that work. So really, across the next couple of weeks, you now have two choices. You can either help me to improve this final module on environmentalism in the 1960s and 70s and improve that because it's particularly weak, or you can make the most of the 10 weeks of really quite intense study that we've done on liberal approaches to the various problems of the social movements in the 1960s and 70s, and a consideration of the various problems that critics of liberal approaches have brought to bear on the same topics and what they think should be done in comparison. And we've also considered the ongoing relevance of these both liberal approaches and criticisms of the liberal approaches to our own consideration of problems today, if similar problems are cropping up again today. So those are your options for the next 2 weeks in the last assignment. And I hope that you'll find it fun to do, a bit of a different task. And I always enjoy reading the creative reflections because they tend to be quite creative and give you a chance to really apply your knowledge in interesting ways. So now, let's turn briefly to the historical context, problems and conflict, which I want to map out today in relation to the issue of climate crisis and living well and dying well on a damaged planet. How can political philosophy help us with this? Well, now you know why I'm not able to map this out in the context of the 1960s and 1970s social movements of environmental activism, which did emerge at this time. So instead, I've chosen to articulate this problem as expressed in the work of a Global South novelist called Amitav Ghosh. Amitav Ghosh has written some beautiful novels, including The Hungry Tide and other novels, which he believes express a problem that Global South people have faced for many, many decades, thematized often in terms of colonization and the effects of colonization on the environments of Global South villages, which then suffered the ill effects of environmental damage caused by mining and other economic forms of activity. And Ghosh points out that even though he wrote these novels about environmental issues, they weren't featured as such as environmental problems. They were featured as problems with colonization or problems managing the devastating impacts of particular forms of economic activity and so forth. And he asks, why is it that we have not, in this text, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, he asks why it is that in the literary tradition of novels, the problem of climate change and environmental catastrophe has really been explored in what he calls the outposts of fiction, science fiction, which has not been viewed as a type of literary writing that's been respected by the journals and by the tradition of writing. So climate crisis, he says, has really only been considered either in the novels of the Global South writers who've been writing about environmental devastation through the lens of the effects of colonisation or the disastrous effects of economic activities on the resources of villages, or it's been considered in the outposts of fiction in climate sci-fi, science fiction, which has not been respected as a great form of literature. And he says the reason for this is because, and I don't know enough about literature to say whether this is true or not, but he says that it's because that the idea of the novel really emerged at the same time as the Industrial Revolution, and it emerged in those countries that were being industrialised. And the great novels became about everyday lives, the lives of people, the minutiae of everyday existence, lives, dramas, interactions, intersubjective exchanges and so forth, lives in those industrialised economies. And he said, so the history of the modern novel is really a history that's entangled with industrialisation, when people began to reflect on their own everyday lives rather than on larger, broader issues and problems. And he says this has led to what he calls a great derangement in literature. He's only talking about novels and literature. He's not talking about political philosophy, but I found it useful because I couldn't find any liberal political philosophy about this, right? So I was wondering whether maybe there's been a great derangement in political philosophy too. Has there been a great derangement in political philosophy? Is it the case that we've just struggled to conceptualise this as a problem for us because we've been focusing on those problems that have been more about our everyday lives and not about our relationship to the environment itself as a constraint on our lives? So it's in the context of my difficulty in being able to thematise what liberal political philosophers said about the problem of environmental crisis, which activists began to touch upon in the 1960s and 1970s, that I turned to Amitav Ghosh, because he deals with what he calls a great derangement in literature that I think may very well apply to political philosophy. Although maybe your own assignment on this issue, if you choose that option, will get me to rethink or to develop that aspect a little bit with more nuance. So in this background, this historical context, problems and conflict, I don't go back to the 1960s and 70s. I don't go back, as I've done in all of the modules, to this time, this important time of the 1960s and 70s as really this point in time of divisive conflict and social change. Rather, I'm looking back and saying, why is it that we haven't been thinking about this enough through political philosophy? And Amitav Ghosh is helping me to try and think through that. So you can see it's a bit of a different lecture this week, isn't it? There are other texts that I could have chosen to map out how contemporary political philosophers are facing this challenge of how to think through responses to climate crisis. There are a range of different approaches now in political philosophy today that look at this issue, both in terms of responsibilities to future generations, responsibilities to existing children, questions like who bears the brunt of environmental damage, questions about the precautionary principle and how this should be applied with respect to which nations should bear most responsibility for the costs of adaptation and the costs of compensation. But I haven't chosen that for this week either. What I did choose was an article that looks at the experience of Global South people living in those areas that are most affected by climate crisis, since this is the problem that Amitav Ghosh sees as the reason why there has been a derangement in literature and I think maybe in political philosophy in thinking about this issue, because the global north has been able to isolate itself more than the global south from these problems. We haven't had to think about these issues as impinging upon our everyday in the same way that the global south has had to face these issues. These are existential issues about everyday existence for people in the global south, and this is why I chose this article today. So what Lyasaka argues in an article called Oceanic Cosmopolitanism, the Complexity of Waiting for Future Climate Refugees, is that the people who are actually now facing the existential crisis of how to live in a place that is now almost inhospitable to human life, how those people experience that existence. And the argument is that waiting may feel like wasted time for people inhabiting these small, low-lying and extremely vulnerable island states with rising sea levels projected to render increasingly uninhabitable their homes and their economic resources that they use to sustain their lives. And this author examines this experience of waiting and the negative implications on climate refugees of waiting, and what we owe to such people in an effort to prevent this waiting. Again, the selection of this article may again reflect that I don't yet control this material, I haven't yet controlled how I want to present this material, but I felt it was an interesting way to think about the topic because it reflects, it focuses on experiences that political philosophers really haven't considered at all because of our tendency to have been able to protect ourselves from the worst effects of climate crisis in the global north. A phenomenon that Amitav Ghosh points out is part of the reason for the great derangement in literature and in political philosophy. So, what we've seen this week is that I've struggled to apply our framework to the environmental activism of the 1960s and 1970s that did occur during this period. And that reflects not so much a fault on my part, because I certainly tried within limited time constraints, but rather an issue that I think is broader, that we have actually not, as a culture, thematized this problem as other problems have been thematized during the 1960s and 70s. So there's a deficit of thinking about this. It wasn't thought about carefully in the 1960s and 1970s or the 80s. And it's more useful to think about why, or well, it's not more useful, it's necessary to think about why as the step to then considering what we now need to do. Next week will be our last for this subject. And what I want to do in that week is finish again in a way that is different to the way we've tackled this subject so far. And again, I'd be interested in your views about how you'd like to finish this subject in future, given that this last module, this 2-week module, is quite different to the other ones. We've seen the same approach, same framework being applied in the other modules prior to this one. And this one has been a struggle. The framework has seemed less appropriate. And so we're finishing in a different way too. If we look back well beyond the 1960s and 1970s to what political thought was like in centuries prior to the present, we find a history replete with creative utopian political thought. People like Thomas More, Robert Owen, Edward Bellamy, and so many others developing socialist utopian ideals. Societies in which domestic labour is cooperatised, where women don't work in homes, where labour is organised collaboratively. And these are both works of political thought and also utopian tracks. But they tend to be accepted as political thought. If you were to do a history of political thought unit, a subject I used to teach myself a few years back, it would not be a surprise to find Thomas More there, or Robert Owen. Edward Bellamy is a different matter, but Thomas More and Robert Owen would certainly not be surprising to find in a history of political thought, along with your classic texts like Hobbes, Locke, Kant, Marx, Rousseau, etc., all in their own historical contexts with different problems that they're facing. But we would be able to access creative utopian political thought in a history of political thinking. Instead of being responsive to urgent problems of the present, although in a sense it was always responsive to urgent problems in the present, domestic labour, injustice, the oppression of the working classes and so forth. So it was, but instead of responding directly to those problems with immediate solutions right now that were deemed to be practicable, these utopian thinkers imagined how societies might be constructed in order to secure the sorts of ideals that political thinkers of those earlier times wanted us to view as desirable. It's a very different way of doing political thinking, right? It's different to the way in which liberal political philosophers have sought to understand the problems we face and the resources that we have to resolve these for ourselves. Liberal political philosophy took a very different form since the 1960s and 1970s. It was like a form of moral constructivism for the political problems of the present. Identify the problem of divisive conflict between competing moral comprehensive doctrines who each want to have the all-purpose resources to be able to pursue the conception of the good life. But that leads into conflict. A problem of justice arises. And so we also conceptualise ourselves as bearers of those faculties that allow us to not only experience this as a problem, but propose ways to overcome it. So yes, we're instrumental. We've got our own moral comprehensive doctrines that might come into conflict with others, and we want these things for ourselves to be able to pursue our conception of the good life. And we conceptualize ourselves as having those faculties that will allow us to overcome it by a sense of justice, giving each other principles that we think are going to be reasonable for others to accept, even if we differ on our moral comprehensive doctrines. So we've seen liberal political philosophers doing something very different to the sorts of idealist utopian thinking that used to be a part of political thinking, particularly a major part of political thinking prior to the 20th century. So what I want to do next week is finish this subject by putting liberal political thought to one side and instead using our imagination with the help of Donna Haraway to imagine societies in which it might be possible to live well and die well on a damaged planet. Thinking and imagining with Donna Haraway. Now, this is not liberal political philosophy, but it's certainly political thought oriented around a particular problem where the solution is meant to encourage us to work towards creating new societies that we would like to live in, which may, according to Donna Haraway, even include things like adopting damaged mountains. So that's where we will end next week. Now, this has been a very different way of finishing the subject, and I'd be interested to hear your reactions, your thoughts, and your ideas for how to improve this for next year, hopefully. I look forward to seeing you on Thursday for a discussion. Bye.